Cuba. A nation that once dazzled the world with its wealth, its nightlife, and its sugar empire, Havana was the jewel of the Caribbean, a playground for the rich, a city of neon lights and endless music. But today, Cuba is a land of scarcity, crumbling buildings, ration lines, and an economy that seems frozen in time. How did this transformation happen? How did one of Latin America's richest nations become one of its poorest? This is not just a story about communism. It is a story about dependence, betrayal, and survival against impossible odds. To understand Cuba's shocking decline, we must rewind to its golden age. When Cuba was king, Havana was booming, and the seeds of collapse were already being planted. In the early 20th century, Cuba was booming, sugar was king, and Cuba was its empire. By the 1950s, Cuba exported more sugar than almost any other nation on earth. The profits poured into Havana, transforming it into one of the most glamorous cities in the Western Hemisphere. American tourists flocked to Havana's casinos, nightclubs, and beaches. For US elites, Cuba was the playground of choice, a place where prohibition didn't exist, where rum flowed freely, and where the nightlife rivaled Las Vegas. But beneath the neon lights and the glamour, ordinary Cubans lived a very different reality. Rural workers worked in sugar fields for low wages. Entire villages lacked electricity or running water. The wealth of Havana was concentrated in the hands of elites and foreign corporations. By the 1950s, US companies owned nearly half of Cuba's sugar industry, along with banks and utilities. Cuba's prosperity was real, but it was not Cuban prosperity. Cuba's GDP per capita ranked among the highest in Latin America, but inequality was staggering. The top 10% lived in luxury, while the bottom half struggled to survive. Havana's casinos glittered, but in the countryside, children went hungry. This paradox, wealth without justice, created the conditions for revolution. Cuba's golden age was built on sugar, tourism, and foreign capital, but it was also built on dependence, and dependence is fragile. When the foundation cracks, the entire structure collapses. That collapse was coming. The glamour of Havana was about to give way to the gunfire of revolution. By the mid-1950s, Cuba's golden age was beginning to rot from within. Fulgencio Batista, once hailed as a reformist soldier, had returned to power not as a savior but as a dictator. His second regime was a shadow play of democracy. Elections rigged, opposition silenced, and the nation's wealth funneled into the pockets of cronies and foreign investors. Havana's casinos glittered under neon lights, but behind the glamour lurked the shadow of the American mafia. The likes of Maya Ransky and Lucky Luciano turned Havana into their Caribbean empire, laundering money through hotels and nightclubs, while ordinary Cubans watched their nation sold piece by piece. In the countryside, resentment boiled. Farmers saw their land swallowed by sugar companies. Workers lived in shacks, while Batista's allies drove luxury cars down Havana's boulevards. The promise of independence, won from Spain decades earlier, seemed empty. Cuba was free in name, but in practice, it was a client state of Washington and Wall Street. Into this world stepped Fidel Castro, a young lawyer with fiery speeches and a vision of justice. Castro embodied the frustration of a generation. He denounced Batista's corruption, the foreign domination of Cuba's economy, and the inequality that left millions in poverty. His words electrified students, workers, and peasants alike. But what Zaron would not overturn Batista, Castro turned to the mountains. In 1956, Castro and a small band of rebels landed in Cuba aboard a yacht named Granma. Most were killed, all captured, but a handful survived, retreating into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. From there, they waged guerrilla war. Their weapons were few, but their determination was immense. Each battle, each ambush, each victory brought on more recruits. By 1958, Batista's army bloated with corruption, and raw morale began to crumble. On New Year's Day, 1959, Batista fled Havana. His dictatorship collapsed overnight. Castro's rebels marched triumphantly into the capital, welcomed by cheering crowds. For millions of Cubans, it felt like liberation. A new era had begun. But Castro's revolution was not just about politics. It was about economics. And the war he was about to wage would reshape Cuba's destiny and plunge it into decades of struggle. Castro's revolution wasn't just political, it was economic warfare. Castro wasted no time. He nationalized industries, took land, and expelled foreign corporations. For Washington, this was unacceptable. The United States imposed an embargo, cutting Cuba off from Western markets. Cuba was isolated, but not alone. The Soviet Union stepped in. Moscow bought Cuban sugar at inflated prices, sent oil, machinery, and billions in aid. Cuba became a socialist showcase in the Americas. Schools expanded, healthcare improved, literacy soared. For a time, the revolution seemed to deliver. But Cuba's prosperity was built on Soviet subsidies. Without Moscow, the experiment could not survive. The Cuban economy was not diversified. It was dependent, first on sugar, then on Soviet aid. And dependence is always dangerous. For 3 decades, Cuba lived under the shadow of the Cold War. It was a pawn in the global struggle between Washington and Moscow. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 nearly brought the world to nuclear war. But beneath the geopolitics, ordinary Cubans lived lives shaped by rationing, central planning, and the constant tension of survival. The revolution had delivered education and healthcare, but it had also delivered scarcity. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba's lifeline would vanish. Cuba's socialist experiment worked, but only because Moscow paid the bills. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, Cuba lost 80% of its trade. The lifeline was gone. What followed was the special period, a time of scarcity, blackouts, and hunger. Cuba's economy shrank by a third. Food disappeared, electricity failed, people survived on bicycles, urban farming, and rationing. The government urged resilience, but desperation spread. Cuba was on the edge of collapse. Families boiled grapefruit peels to make soup. Doctors performed surgeries without electricity. Children fainted in schools from hunger. The revolution that had promised dignity now delivered desperation. Yet Cuba survived. Through ingenuity, solidarity, and sheer endurance, the nation endured the special period. But the scars remain. The collapse of the USSR proved that Cuba's model was unsustainable without external support. Cuba had to reinvent itself or starve. To survive, Cuba opened its doors to tourism. Resorts sprang up. Foreign currency flowed in. The government allowed limited private enterprise. Restaurants, taxis, small shops. Dollars became lifelines. But inequality returned. Tourists enjoyed luxury buffets while locals queued for rations. A double economy emerged. one for foreigners with dollars, another for Cubans with pesos. The revolution's promise of equality was fading. Taxi drivers and more than doctors, families with relatives abroad thrived, while others struggled. The gap widened. Cuba's survival came at the cost of its ideals. Tourism kept Cuba afloat, but it also made the nation vulnerable. Global crises like the pandemic shut down tourism overnight, plunging Cuba back into scarcity. The double economy remains a source of tension and inequality. Cuba's survival came at the cost of its ideals. Today, Cuba remains trapped between socialism and capitalism, sanctions and survival. The US embargo continues. The government clings to central planning, but inefficiency stifles growth. Tourism helps, but global crises expose Cuba's fragility. Modern protests erupt in Havana, demanding change. Young Cubans dream of opportunities abroad. The government promises reform, but progress is slow. Cuba's future is uncertain. Without diversification, modernization, and reform, the cycle of scarcity will continue. The shocking truth is that Cuba's poverty is not inevitable. It is the result of choices, dependence, and history. Cuba was once rich. It became poor. And unless it changes, it may remain trapped forever.